Were there more cities like Harar in the Horn of Africa that disappeared? This is a topic that comes up in one of the articles that are in the compilation of the book I'm reading at the moment, The Somalis and Their Lands. And this is an article that was written by one Lieutenant William Christopher Barker. Lieutenant William Christopher Barker traveled to the lands of the Somalis in 1840, and then he had this article published by the Royal Geographical Society of London in 1848. It's a very short article, but also very interesting. In this article, he also tells us, or he describes in detail, the currency of Harar, and he tells us what it was called and how it looked. I'm going to read that part. He also tells us about information he was given by the locals because he traveled to Zeila. He went all the way to Harar, and he was going to Shewa, actually. That was where they were going. And he tells us about the stories he was told about the ancestors of the Isaac people. Let's start with the part where he discusses the people of the area where he visited, Zeila, and then going all the way to Harar. And I need to warn you again, and I like doing this because sometimes we run into issues when we don't understand these texts in the right context. We need to understand these texts written by Europeans in the right context, otherwise we might get terrible ideas. And I need to warn you that these are things he was told, number one. And number two, this was a European, we could say a colonialist. Of course, during this time, 1840, they had not really colonized the land, but they were planning to, because in this article, this individual tells us that he had been sent actually to go and formally take charge of a part or an island that had been bought in what is known today as Djibouti. And this is what he writes about that assignment. He says that the islands of Mushak, having been purchased for the British government from the Sultan of Tanjore, I had the honor of taking possession of them in the name of our most gracious queen on the 31st of August 1840. So colonization had just begun. They had bought these islands from the Sultan of Tanjore. I don't know the specific details of how that purchase went. So we need to understand, the point is we need to understand these texts in the right context so that we don't get some things mixed up. So Lieutenant Barker travels, he goes to Zeila, goes to Berbera, it mentions that he passed through possibly near Harar, and then he goes to Shewa, that's where he was going. And then he writes this article a few years down the road, published by the Royal Geographical Society of London. Now let's read to see what he wrote about the people, and we are talking about the people who are found in what we know today as Somaliland. And this is what he writes. I learned from several individuals that the ancient name of the coast, now called Bur Hebrawal, was Bur Hisak, who was the father of the Somali. He, dying, left three sons, Abu Gurhajis, Hebrawal, and Abu Dezalal. The latter's mother was a slave. From these three are descended the numerous tribes of Somali, the principal of whom are the Ayal Abu Gurhajis, Ayal Hamed, Ayal Guded, Ayal Shor Drown, Ayal Hosha, Ayal Muhammad, and Ayal Groms. This is information he was given. Again, I have to repeat, we need to be very careful with this information. He continues, I could not obtain any information as to the strength of each tribe. In former years, they inhabited the coast from Meat in the vicinity of Met Island, eastwards to Cape Guardafui, and along the east coast of Africa towards the equator. But as the Gala, who then inhabited these parts of the coast, retreated towards the interior, they occupied their places. So basically, it's kind of like saying the Somalis occupied more or less to the southern part of what we know today as Somaliland. But then the northern part, most likely maybe it was the Oromos who occupied those lands. But then as the Oromos moved, the Somalis moved northwards. That's what he says he was told. Now, let's read the part where he talks about the coin that was used in Harar. He describes it with a lot of detail. And this is what he writes. He says, they have a small copper. And this is after he has given us sort of detailed description of the city of Harar. He tells us about the different gates that the city had, or still has, I think. He tells us about the emir, and in fact, he gives us the name of the emir who ruled by then. He tells us about how power was transferred from one individual to another. He describes a situation where the members of the royal family, usually the males, will be put in sort of sort of a bunker where they would not live as they wanted. And if it was suspected that they were conspiring maybe to remove from power the reigning emir, then they would run into problems. He tells us all that. But then, of course, after that, he tells us about the currency. And he also tells us about the trading that used to happen from Harar all the way to Zeeland, Berbera, and back, and the kind of stuff that used to be, of course, traded. Now, he says this. They have a small copper coin called Mahala, 22 of which are equal to a nominal coin called Hashrefi. 40 Ashrefi are equal to 1 German crown. Now, German crown is a coin or a unit that the British used to have. And I've talked about this in another video because it's so confusing. They call it a German crown, but it is a British unit of account, we can say. So he's comparing what 40 Ashrefi is equal to 1 German crown. He says, the Mahala resembles the small copper coin used about Jeddah. On the one side is written in Arabic characters, there is no God but God. And on the reverse, the name of the reigning prince. So looks like this coin was similar to one that was found in Jeddah, but of course it had some details that were different. For example, it says on one side it was written there is no God but God, but on the reverse or the other side is written the name of the reigning emir of Harar. Now, I also need to point out that in this article, he does not write Harar as Harar. He writes it as Urur. And it's not just him who writes it like that. Most of these other articles you are going to find in this book actually write Harar as Urur. And somebody pointed out something that I found even more interesting. He said that probably that Hurur comes from a name Somalis called Sogam. And one thing that is very interesting about Harar is that there was a lot of sorghum grown around the city. Now, I don't know whether this person is right about this, but he brings up that there's a possibility that Hurur actually has some relations with the name of sorghum. Now, let's read the part where he talks about ancient cities that were found in the Horn of Africa. Of course, Harar is one of the most known. And of course, there are others, not just Harar. Of course, there are others like Sheikh Hussein. And I've talked about Sheikh Hussein in another video. It's also one of those cities, or we can call them towns, that have some religious significance. And in fact, when I was reading another document, it said that the person who found Sheikh Hussein actually came from Harar, or he had traveled to Harar. There were two of them, and then they moved to the site where Sheikh Hussein is, and they founded this city, and there were others. Now, in this article that we are going to read, or in this article that I'm reading by this one Lieutenant Baka, he mentions talking to some Somalis who told him of another city that have not seen being mentioned anywhere. And this is what he writes. He says, while I was at Zeila in November 1840, I saw a small caravan of Kavila or Havila. I think this is a caravan of traders, as it is called here by the Gudu Bursi, Somalis, consisting of about 25 men and several women, with some few children. They had come to Zeila to exchange the produce of their country, the same as that of the Isa, for grain, blue cloth, and I guess that is etc. and more. They gave me a description of ruins of an ancient town, which they called Haroa, 9 days' journey to the south of Zeila. Now, they give that name as Haroa. Of course, now we are running into issues here because even Harar is not written as Harar, is written as Hurur. So probably this name, most likely, or there's a possibility, the way it is written, if there's somebody who knows about it, probably they know it in another name, most likely. But what he points out is that there is a likelihood of people mistaking it for Harur or for Hurur because they are very close. And even me, the first time I read, I was like, that's most likely Hurur or Harar. But he says this must not be confounded with Hurur, which they also know. So these people who are telling him about this town, the ruins, it's not the town, these were ruins of a town that used to exist. They told him they knew of Harar or Hurur as he writes it, but there was also this other town, but it was no longer there. It was ruins. One thing I have found to be very interesting about the Horn of Africa is the existence of ruins that are not explained, or that we don't talk about, or we don't get to see in historical documents. Reading some of these, for example, reading, I think is Richard Burton and also H.G.C. Swain, they do mention ruins. I think Richard Burton in particular does mention being directed to ruins. And also, I think H.G.C. Swain also actually does mention him being told by the locals that there is this ruins, and actually goes and he sees these ruins. But there's very little information about these ruins, and some of them, he doesn't even get the name that they used to go by. And sometimes the local don't share detailed information about these ruins. But they are there, they can be seen. Now, I don't know whether many of these ruins still exist, because most of these documents, of course, were written in the 19th century when these ruins were seen. I don't know whether today those ruins still exist. I think it's an area that needs a lot of investigation. And if they still exist, it's very important that it is known what were these towns and how did they come to be and what happened to them. I think it's important for us to know. And of course, as I said, we need to read these documents in the right context or with the right understanding, so that, and the context I'm talking about here is to understand who wrote the document and what time was the document written and what was the prevailing knowledge or understanding or mannerism even, or view about different people. What were the prevailing those conditions, so that when you understand the prevailing conditions, you tend to understand these documents in the right context. Now, this is the second article in this book. That's a compilation of articles that were published by the Royal Geographical Society of London between 1830 and 1890. You can get this book on Amazon. I'm making arrangements to have it available on Nuria. You can get it as a hard copy. You can get it as a Kindle copy. If you are watching on YouTube, of course, check the description box, check the pinned comment. If you are watching on TikTok, go check the bio. You'll find a link there and it will take you to the place where you can find this book. Those are my random thoughts.